Hello and welcome to this live webinar. This is Paul Tunner from Pharma Forum, and today I'm moderating an absolutely fascinating discussion on powering pharma's commercial teams with market access insights. Now, I'm not going to steal the thunder of my two panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment too much, but clearly market access is a critical issue for any pharma company wherever you are in the world. And I think being able to harness data, translate them into insights that are useful in the field has immediate direct commercial benefits. I think we're going to cover a lot of ground here this evening. I'm joined in covering this topic by two real experts. From Zephyr Health, we have Leilani Latimer, who will be presenting a kind of strategic view and how technology fits into this. We were due to have Lance Scott originally, and that's a last-minute change, but otherwise the format is totally the same. And then following Leilani, I'm pleased to say we've got John Stahl, who's partnered with DRG Consulting, who'll be building on that to talk about what this means in terms of changing engagement models for field forces. And as I've outlined already, this is truly a global issue. So some of the references and examples we'll talk about here may be more US-centric, but they apply wherever you are in the world. So the presentations component of this will be fairly brief, a couple of short presentations there, and then we really get into the meat of it, which is taking your questions, and you can submit those through the panel. You can type your question into the panel you see on your screen, and we'll try and cover as many of those as we can during the 1 hour presentation. We should have at least half an hour or so for those. We will also be getting you involved by throwing a few polls out there, simple multiple choice, just to do a bit of a straw poll literally on your views on certain aspects of market access, and I'll launch the first of those very shortly. And if you're into Twitter, we'll be flagging some key points on Twitter using hashtag #PPWebinar, and you can even ask questions through Twitter, and we'll try and feed those in as well. So as I say, we've got an hour for this discussion. We'll have short presentations, then we'll take your questions. You can ask whatever you like, and we'll try and cover as many as we can. Without further ado, I'm going to first of all launch our first poll before I hand over to Leilani. So the first question, you'll see this pop up just beneath your screen, is very simple. How important do you think market access data and insights are to commercial teams? And you've got four options: extremely important, important, somewhat important, and not important at all. So if I click on start voting, you should now see those options. You can vote. Don't need to do it immediately, but do share your views. We're not going to shout out anybody's individual view. It's just to get a sense of your thoughts. And we'll come back to that once we've got to the end of the initial presentation. So I will now hand over to Leilani to talk us through her perspective on where we're heading in terms of market access insights and their relevance to pharma's commercial teams. Leilani, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm actually going to start off talking a little bit about a macro view of the industry, and in particular the data scenario, and then I'll bring that straight back to market access. So healthcare is still the fastest growing sector of big data, and year on year it's growing at about 48%. What isn't factored into that statistic is that about 80% of those data sources are unstructured data sources, which means it's extremely difficult to link these to other data sources. Additionally, that statistic does not include the amount of data many of you are creating internally in your companies, and that could be from reports to dashboards or to spreadsheets. So in the big picture, what we're seeing with our customers is the need to connect these valuable and changing market access data sources with other important data sources to fully operationalize market access data. So what we did earlier this year was we launched a global survey to look at how could we better understand these changing dynamics between market access and traditional commercial teams. So this is very much focused on commercializing, operationalizing market access to better commercialize products, identifying the most valuable insights for those successful sales strategies, and discovering really what are the current challenges, gaps, and possible solutions for that. So as we looked across that, getting those responses back, and again, just to set the scene for who participated in this survey, we had over 60 pharmaceutical executives from sales roles, marketing roles, and market access roles participate. And overwhelmingly what we found was they all stated that market access data is being used and needs to be used as part of their brand go-to-market strategies. What I found actually interesting, and it is in the survey report, so if any of you are interested, we've actually provided a link to the full report. 73% of both of these groups, or all of these groups, said that they're using market access data as a source of insight into the various stages of the reimbursement journey. So as we think about what's working and what's not working, one of the key findings from the survey was really that over 73% of respondents said that they were having issues with commercial performance and operationalizing the data, as we said. But really what they all highlighted was that they still continue to work in these siloed solutions. So whether they're in siloed departments, whether they're using siloed data sources, that not communicating or the lack of communication across different areas of the organization continues to be a major hurdle for them. Again, one of the biggest barriers to getting the efficiencies and operationalizing the pull-through of formulary status changes from the managed care teams all the way through to the physician-facing field reps. So whether it's market access data or other data, across the board, we're hearing our customers say that they're focused on more efficiently sharing and connecting the insights across the entire enterprise so that they can get a shared view of the market and a shared view of what the healthcare provider landscape looks like. And again, this getting them to what that total treatment pathway is. So again, one of the findings from the survey was, well, what are the customers doing? What are the pharma teams doing to improve things? And one of the key findings is that they actually said they're planning to re-engineer their sales teams within the next 3 years. And this is essentially as a means of closing the gap between the brand teams and the market access teams. So we went into some specifics. What exactly are they doing to re-engineer? What are some of the initiatives that they're looking at? And we found it could be around key account management, and I know my esteemed colleague John is going to get into some more details on this. It could be around looking at how they upskill the field force to combine these skills and this skill set between sales, market access, and customer engagement. But overwhelmingly what we heard was, in all cases, it's absolutely essential that these changes are accompanied by technology innovation. And what I might add is, it's not necessarily a component of this survey report, but what is highly influencing all of the pharma organizations today is digital transformation. You'll find that most of our customers, they talk to us about it consistently, and you hear a lot about it in the marketplace, is what are they doing around digital transformation? And market access has to be a component of these digital transformation efforts. So it has to be, again, essential that as they're looking at re-engineering the teams, that is accompanied by not just the integrated data, but also those underlying systems and technology solutions that can support those teams through that innovation. So the key takeaways, again, is really, what can you do? If we think about what we tried to do at the end of the report is pull out really what are the key learnings you can take back to your companies if you think about, again, if you're coming across some of the same hurdles, if you feel like this resonates with you, what are some of the things that you can do as you go back to your organization and say, what are we doing around market access and operationalizing pull-through? It's really helping identify those gaps and silos in the organization between the market access teams and the prescriber-facing teams. Putting, of course, the commercial teams in the driver's seat, so upskilling commercial teams, giving them those additional skill sets around market access and the data at their fingertips is absolutely helpful in making that transformation. And then finally, again, powering them with the technology that makes it real-time. So those are real-time alerts when a formulary status change has been made. It's that insight about the prescriber or possibly the payer group and the change to the payer group, and making sure that the commercial teams are up to speed and getting the latest and greatest view of the marketplace and the customer in that environment. So with that, Paul, maybe we can open it up to some of your comments or questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Leilani. And just to sort of remind, you can the white paper that's being referenced that contains some of these survey results, if you click on attachments and links, you can go to where you can download a copy of that. And I would recommend it because obviously what we're presenting here is just some high-level statistics, and there's a bit more detail in that piece as you drill through. But I guess what leaps out at me, Leilani, as you talk through that is just, we have data everywhere, and we have useful data potentially everywhere when it comes to market access. But that creates some real technological challenges and organizational challenges in companies trying to, I guess, utilize that and keep up with the pace of change, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess what we're really seeing in the marketplace today is, as I said earlier, a lot of that data is just very difficult to connect. So it's hugely important. We think about everything from, Sunshine Act data to market access data and formulary changes. How do you link those diverse and very frequently disparate data sources to get those insights into the hands of your physician-facing teams more easily and more quickly?
Yep. And I guess there's a risk if you're using sources that you can't connect because, it all adds value, it all adds a piece of the puzzle, and I guess it's the pieces that you don't know that can potentially damage your strategy.
Yeah, and I think, when I was talking about the digital transformation, I think a huge portion of that, if you think about a brand's go-to-market strategy, a big piece of that is the channel strategy as well. So what are the ways you're engaging with your target customer audience? Again, those can be many and multi-stakeholders when we're talking about pharma. And clearly the channels are also equally important. So when a change is made, how do you know and how can you more quickly and easily manage both your non-personal channels as well as your personal channels of customer engagement? And I think that's another, again, very essential piece of this is how can you get the data as quickly to your non-personal channels as you can to your personal channels?
Yeah, and I know we're going to hear more from John around that aspect because clearly digital and technology underpins a lot of the growth in data here and how we can collate that data together to generate insights, but how that's used, as you say, is very much not about just digital. It's about that kind of offline and online interactions. We could talk about this all day, I'm sure. I want to make sure we get onto some of those questions that are coming in. So I'm going to hand over to John shortly, but I want to just take a look at that poll that I started right at the start. Question being, how important do you think market access data and insights are to commercial teams? A number of you voting. Some of you not voting. I'd encourage everyone to share their view. We're not going to judge you on it, just interesting to see where you are. And I guess we slightly led the witness with this question a little bit because if I stop voting there, as you will see, we have 82% of you saying it's extremely important, 17% saying it's important. Obviously, that doesn't quite add up to 100. Those of you that are eagle-eyed will know that's because it's rounding the percentages. But nobody's saying somewhat important or not important at all. We kind of might expect that on this webinar, I guess. But that reinforces, doesn't it, Leilani, what we saw in the survey, which is people know this is critical stuff.
Yep, absolutely.
Very good. All right, I'm going to keep things moving on. That set the scene really nicely around how things are changing, where technology comes in, some of the organizational challenges, and that feeds in really nicely to our second presenter, John, who's going to talk about how that translates through to the field force on the ground and the key account management model. Before I do that, let me just go back to our polls because I want to set you going with another question while we're thinking about that. And this one, maybe not quite so obvious, but this is getting your views on how much visibility of market access data and insights do your commercial teams have. So your commercial folks out there on the front line. And if I start voting on that, we've got 4 options. Full visibility, can they see all of the market access data and insights? Some visibility, little visibility, they can hardly see much of it, or indeed no visibility. Either answer for your company. If you're not sat within a pharma company, maybe answer on behalf of your clients. Just interesting to see where people are on that spectrum of visibility of data. And we'll come back to that after John. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John Stahl from DRG to give his perspective on evolving models of customer engagement. John, once again, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon and good evening to everyone listening. And Leilani, thank you for setting things up here. I thought what we could do in terms of the approach is knowing how important market access is to the commercialization of our our pharma assets and our medical device assets, take a quick look at what is one of the most important trends that I saw in the research that Airline presented is the overwhelmingly large move to key account management. And so where we can start is talk about how did this all come to be. And at DRG, we like to organize ourselves and talk about 4 main macro trends that are driving the healthcare ecosystem. And you can see those there on the left-hand side of the screen, primarily the rapid innovation that we're seeing in new drug development, the pace of change that we're seeing in terms of new innovation, and the type of evidence that different decision makers are requiring. A second large macro trend is around our evolution of the healthcare delivery chain. As Paul led at the very beginning, this tends to be a little bit more U.S.-centric in terms of some of the vertical integration that we're seeing here in the United States with the rise of large ID and health systems. But it's a trend, nonetheless, that we can find globally as new stakeholders and new pathways are being developed to deliver care more efficiently. Certainly a third macro trend around the evolution of the healthcare funding streams, whether this is all around access and value, that 5-letter word beginning with V that has crept into all of the discussions that we're having on a regular basis, and many different types of stakeholders wanting to have a say and a seat at the table around how do you define value and what is value in terms of new medicines or new therapies. And then lastly, as we think about technology, and we just spent a fair amount of that from a market access perspective, let's just think about what is happening in the broader ecosystem. And so we're seeing a lot of convergence in terms of drug, device, and digital combinations. This is enabling new partnership models, new types of innovative products coming to market, predictive decision-making tools and systems are being developed to better treat patients. And we just spent a fair amount of time about the rise of digital and the rise of social as patients are just becoming more literate. They're becoming more involved in their healthcare, and all stakeholders, especially pharma, need to really be thinking about their digital strategies and their social strategies as they're engaging stakeholders in the future world.
Sorry to interject, John, but I would just say briefly, we appreciate there's quite a lot of detail in some of the presentations here. As ever, we've got a couple of presenters that can, talk about this in great detail, and we're sort of slightly scratching the surface here. But of course, this whole live webinar is available on demand. So if you want to go back afterwards, take a look at this and take more time, refresh your memory on the comments, feel free to do that. And the contact details for both of our presenters are in the webinar slides if you have direct questions as well. Sorry, John, back over to you.
Hey, no worries, Paul. Thank you so much. And so I won't go into a great bit of detail, but underpinning all of these macro trends, we can find different market access elements. And so as we're thinking about how does market access influence the evolving customer engagement model, there's new requirements from a evidence perspective. So if we're looking at scientific innovation, the evidence thresholds that are required to get drug approval are very different than the evidence elements that our payer stakeholders, our HCP stakeholders, our health system stakeholders are using to evaluate products for access. If we look within the evolution of the healthcare delivery chain, certainly in that, we talk about new stakeholders and new pathways. How do we have access to those new stakeholders? Which stakeholders do we need to be focusing on? It's moved beyond the physician, and there's a lot of other influential stakeholders in the delivery chain that are influencing treatment decisions. As we think about the healthcare funding macro trend, we have, again, new ways of paying for medicines, new pilots that are being proposed by CMS and private payers here in the United States, all about access to medications and how do you balance access and innovation ultimately. And so what a lot of pharma companies that we are working with and other medical device companies have been doing it for some time, but really over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a rapid rise in a move to key account management as a response to these macro trends. And so what we're seeing in the marketplace is pharma companies, biotech companies, medtech companies, still engaging in that one-on-one selling model. You still have field teams that are responsible for calling on HCPs, whether they are hospital stakeholders or outpatient stakeholders, but more and more developing key account teams focused on the most important customers. And here in the United States, oftentimes that is taking on a focus around the integrated delivery network or the integrated health system. And really the role of the key account manager is to better address the unmet needs that these stakeholders have from a system perspective, and then ultimately develop those partnerships that will benefit the health system and the manufacturer over the long run. And then you can see sort of in terms of the focus, ultimately the companies that we're working with that have developed this key account management model and are really perfecting it are up at that top of the pyramid where they are actually co-developing new solutions. These are solutions that go beyond the brand. They are partnering programs and other strategies with the customers, and so the customers have a seat at the table, and there's co-development, and that is truly the definition of a strategic partnership. And so ultimately, as we think about where this key account management model continues to go in the future, and what pharma companies and other companies should continue to think about. And Paul, I think I'm having some trouble advancing to my next slide, so if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide.
Let me see if I can move that forward for you, John, no problem. Oh, we've gone forward a few now. Let's go back a little bit. Nobody jumped off just yet. There we go.
And so ultimately, as we think about what that changing customer engagement model needs to be, we have a set of 5 recommendations as we work with our different clients. One is really thinking about who the most influential customers are. Those are organized customers, and ultimately developing the appropriate ways to target them, to segment them, and to bring data to them. As we think about the second main change that we're asking our customers to make is to really think about that focus around clinical value and economic value. And in doing so, Airline mentioned about upscaling the field force. This takes the form of being able to train those customer-facing teams, not only just on the clinical merits of the product, but what are those economic merits? What are those market access merits of the product, so that our field teams can be most conversant in addressing all of the needs that our customers have. The third major engagement trend that we're seeing, and we're asking our customers to make, is to bring together the medical teams and health economics teams that have traditionally been separate from the commercial function, but create a partnership within the pharma companies so that there's greater coordination and greater collaboration among those 3 teams. Lastly, as we move on to the last 2, we think about generating evidence. We spoke about the needs that different stakeholders have, whether it's an HCP or a payer, and often those needs for evidence are very different than the needs that the FDA has. This is manifesting itself in real-world evidence and big data, and so really building on those capabilities to continue to grow out and develop new ways to generate clinical data and economic data to support the value propositions of our products. And then lastly, bringing it all back to the patient. Really making sure at the end of the day that there's a greater understanding and a greater enablement of the patient journey. Market access up to this point, as we think about the classic patient journey, has not typically been integrated. Has been mostly a clinical journey if we look at it, but market access is certainly a key component of any patient journey going forward, really understanding where access plays in terms of leverage points and ultimately to build out those strategies. So, Paul, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. Again, covering a fascinating topic at, quite a sort of skimming the surface level, but a lot to take in there. Just as a reminder to the people listening in, we're going to come on to your questions very shortly. We've got questions coming in already, so you can type in your questions through the questions tab, submit them in. They are anonymous. I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but we'll try and answer the key ones for you. And as I can see things shaping up with the second poll that we've launched, which I'm going to leave open for a few more minutes, this one is shaping up to be a little bit more interesting. So if you haven't voted already, do get your vote in, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. But I guess just to reflect on what you've presented there, John, one of the key points for me, and you mentioned this quite early in your presentation, this fact that the evidence requirements that you need to present to your customers to meet what are the traditional regulatory requirements, the clinical evidence, are actually quite different to the payer requirements, the value case for medical interventions. And that, for me, has been a core shift that's underpinning a lot of what we're talking about here with the needs for changing customer-facing teams, new technology, integrating data from insights. And, I wonder if you'd sort of agree, John, and indeed Leilani, that, this emerged in certain markets, but I see this really being a global issue now. You look at big markets like the US, there are very sophisticated economic models being put to play by some of the big insurers there. Is that something you'd agree with?
Totally, Paul. It's something that we're being asked by our clients to help them strategize every day now. And ultimately, what this has manifested itself in is getting that payer stakeholder input earlier and earlier in the clinical development process. And there's a lot of best case examples, advisory boards, focus panels, other ways to make sure you get those payer stakeholders engaged in the clinical development of the product early on, helping to identify those meaningful endpoints, helping you to identify what are the meaningful standards of care. For the FDA, the standard of care has often been placebo, and we all talk to payers, and they don't want placebo-based trials. So getting the payers and trying to understand from them, what do they view as the standard of care? And this, to your point, Paul, may differ across markets. And so all the more reason to get multiple global input into the clinical development process from a payer perspective early on.
Absolutely. And Leilani, just to bring you back in there with your perspective, are you sort of seeing this as a major driver in big markets like the US now of changing behavior and changing systems?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, more and more, if you don't have a foundational, let's call it technology solution, but really that provides you that single view of the marketplace and the customer across the teams that John referenced, whether it's clinical, medical education, et cetera, it is absolutely essential at this point in time with so many different stakeholders in the process that our customers we're hearing it every day, that they have that single view of the customer.
Yeah, interesting. So let's take a look at that second poll that I activated and stop the voting on that, because it is panning out a little bit more evenly. So the question, just to remind you, was we were asking you around how much visibility of market access data and insights do your commercial teams have, ranging from full visibility down to no visibility. And we're seeing quite an interesting spread here. So kind of 8% either end saying either no visibility or full visibility. I'm sure there's some people listening would love to know what those companies are doing. And then 41%, again, evenly split between little visibility and some visibility. Now, this is, as I say, a bit of a straw poll. It's not a statistically powered survey, but it kind of reflects what we saw in our survey, doesn't it, Leilani?
Yes, absolutely. I think what I would say is that in that little and some visibility is probably a mix of, again, what are, in some cases, some less automated solutions, and for sure the desire to have full visibility. Yeah.
But I guess it comes back to what I was saying before around even if you've got some visibility or even good visibility, if, as we're suggesting here, there are some companies that are really gaining closer to full visibility, that could be the edge that gives a real commercial advantage. Does that statistic surprise you, John?
It does, and in terms of my background, prior to joining DRG Consulting, I spent over 10 years on the manufacturer side working for two large multinational pharma companies. And this was something that we always struggled with of how can we make sure that our commercial teams have the relevant market access insights, even before we get to insight, have the relevant market access data and insights at the appropriate time. So somewhat surprising that it's still overwhelmingly over 80% are reporting little to some visibility, and over 90%, in that the bottom three buckets. And I think this gets back to some things that Leilani mentioned earlier, is just the organizations not only just having data that doesn't talk to one another, that's unstructured, that has to be integrated, but organizational models that are still operating very siloed. And so one of the things that, as we talk about key account management, we talk about other ways in which our life science manufacturers can develop their organizational models, really making sure that market access is at the core of what you think about, has been very influential in how some of these companies have moved and developed these technological solutions to enable better market access insights. So I am surprised that it's still somewhat little, but I can understand why, having been on the life science manufacturer side.
Exactly. Very good. Well, we've got one more poll question I'm going to throw at the audience to think about as we go now into our taking questions from the audience, and quite a few questions coming in that I want to run through. And this is a very practical question. So we seem to have established so far that there is a bit of a barrier in terms of we know market access data insights is important for commercial teams, but what we've just seen is they've not always got access to that, and there are a number of challenges there. So the final question I'm going to throw out here is, what is the biggest barrier for commercial teams wishing to use market access data and insights? And you have four options here. It may be that you think it's something else outside of these options. If you do, then please indulge us and pick whichever one you think is most relevant. We can only do up to 4 or 5 options within these polls. But the 4 options we've got here are lack of access, lack of training, lack of tools, and lack of strategic alignment between teams. And when we talk about lack of access, we're talking about lack of access to insights. So we've covered off a number of these issues. I'm quite interested to see where people land in terms of which they think is the biggest barrier for commercial teams. Vote away on that. As I've said before, all the votes are anonymous. We're not going to pick anybody up on their answer. We're not going to tell your boss. So let us know what you think, and we'll come back to that. Let's start with some questions then. So one of the questions, here we are, we've been talking for half the webinar about market access. It's a relatively new concept if you think about the age of the industry, and people use the definition in different ways. So I thought it might just worthwhile stepping back. And Leilani, if I come to you first on this, are you seeing different uses of the term within pharma and life science companies, and how would you define market access in terms of what we're describing here?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, let me give you the marketer's answer and then relate it back to the industry, because at the very, very basic level, if you own a product, part of your go-to-market strategy has to be who is going to pay for this product, how much is it going to cost, and what channels will I sell this product through, at the most basic level. Now, I say that, and of course we go to this industry where who is going to pay for the product? Well, multiple stakeholders. What channels am I going to sell it through? Multiple stakeholders. The buyer and user are, of course, very, very distinct. And, of course, the prescriber. So you have what is essentially not a linear product selling and marketing process, but very, very complex and getting more complex, actually. So I think when we talk about market access, it really has to be the perspective of, can you get your product to the people that need it, and will you get paid for your product, right? So again, to me, it's really that fundamental. We still have to think about it in the simplistic way, and I think John brought out some great points. Is you really need to be thinking about that at the development process. In the technology world, we say frequently engineers make the mistake of saying they've built the most beautiful product, and we'll figure out later who will buy it, and the product may not be successful because of that. They need to be thinking as they're building the product who will buy it and what they'll pay for it. And I think John really highlighted that in some of the changes in the industry. Is this has to be thought about much further upstream, and again, at a time when things seem to be getting more complex, not less complex.
Absolutely. And John, just to take that over to you, I mean, do you see a differential in the understanding of what market access is, and would you agree with that definition by Leilani?
I would totally agree. I mean, I think up to this point, market access has maybe been restricted or thought of as in the domain of the payer. But if we're not thinking about the HCP, if we're not thinking about the patient, if we're not thinking about the caregiver, if we're not thinking about the ultimate end payer, then we're missing out on what market access is. At the end of the day, it's about getting drugs, getting products, getting these great solutions to our healthcare challenges to patients in the most rapid, most efficient way possible, and removing those barriers that would prevent patients from having access to these great innovations. So really broadening that definition beyond the payer, to include what does it mean from an HCP standpoint, what does it mean from a patient standpoint. I can see the blending and the blurring, but it's so critical that all of the stakeholders be thought of to solve the market access challenge.
Absolutely. There's an interesting quote I've come across before, and it's normally used around adherence, but I think it equally applies to market access, which is, drugs don't work in people that don't take them, or in this case, don't have access to them. So it has become a critical thing. So,
well, and I would add to that, Paul. There's so much conversation taking place today around the patient journey, and if the right reimbursement and financial situations are not in place, that may be a short journey for that patient.
Exactly.
So the whole patient journey, again, is we have to think about it more broadly and think about, again, am I in a category to get reimbursement or not? How will my treatment be paid for? Again, we really don't want to make it such a short journey, or we want to make it short in a positive way where, again, those complexities actually get resolved.
Yeah, and the short journey analogy works out in another way as well, which is, something I'm seeing in the markets, which is even where treatments are being seen as valuable and securing market access, that's not necessarily a sort of single gate system. It could be down the line, if the evidence is not there, that decision is reevaluated. Certainly within the UK, that's something we're starting to see more and more. So for me, it just reinforces that this is a continuous cycle of gathering the right information, putting it in the hands of the commercial teams. We've got some good questions coming in. I think at this point we're 37 minutes or so in, we've warmed up a little bit. So let's start with some of the more hot potato questions. I'm obviously presenting from over in the UK, and our two expert panelists are based in the US. And one of the questions that's come in is talking about the relative US and European environment, and the question is suggesting that based on what we're describing here and what they see, they kind of feel that maybe Europe or UK is slightly ahead in terms of this CAM model and inclusion of more cross-functional market access working. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's true, or are they different in different ways? Do you want to tackle that first, Leilani?
I was actually going to say, let's hear from John, because he's doing, I think, so much more work. Well, in the key account management consulting, I'd love to get his perspective first.
Yeah, John, what do you think? Do you think we're further ahead when it comes to this in Europe and the UK?
I would say that there's a lot that us in the US can learn from our colleagues abroad, and up to this point, the United States, we haven't had to focus on key account management as much, and I beg or plead that this is not a new concept. The companies that I worked previously, were starting to do this 10, 15 years ago, with select customers. But really, the emphasis that we're seeing now is if you don't have a CAM strategy, it is so difficult to have impact with key customers. As we think about the rise of the integrated delivery network and the health system here in the U.S., the pace of change over the last 2 to 3 years as systems have consolidated and integrated has just been rapid. And in order to be successful, continue to be successful in the future, really making sure that you have a key account strategy, alongside a sales strategy. You can't have one without the other. It is going to be important, but certainly there is a lot that we can learn from our colleagues globally. The systems that they're dealing with are structured differently, and the U.S. is now catching up in terms of the health system space. Payers were still a bit fragmented. So I wouldn't say it's a new concept, but it's something that has taken on just really a lot of increased importance here in the U.S. Of late.
Yeah, very interesting. Leilani, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so what I would add, I totally agree with the person who asked the question. It is absolutely what we hear from our European customers are very much using the key account management model. I think what I would say the difference between the markets is that when I call it moving upstream, what I really mean is the engagement of medical science teams. I think what we're starting to see is that part of that key account management, and this is not every country, but we've seen more and more lately a deeper engagement with medical education. So that's where I would say I think, yes, the model's been in place much longer. And again, when we work with our customers, that is how they are structured. But what we're seeing, the evolution we're seeing in the European marketplace is deeper engagement with the medical education teams now as part of that key account management. So not all of, and again, as the person who asked the question noted, it is very country specific. You can't really say Europe, so it is very specific to each country.
Yeah, we're definitely not a single country over here in Europe. If other people want to chip in their thoughts, by the way, because the question is not just directed to our presenters, it is broadly directed. Instead of asking a question, you can just add a comment, and I'll pick up on those as we go through. I guess just to add to what John and Leilani have said, my observation as somebody who's sitting in the UK and has worked in the UK, I think you could maybe argue that because of things like NICE, in terms of organisational change, there's been some early adaptation. But I think you can't get away from the fact that a lot of the technological change that's underpinning the ability to really get insight from all this big data, I think is being driven by the US. And it's probably no surprise, Leilani, that companies like Zephyr Health are obviously based on the West Coast, which is where a lot of technological innovation is being driven. So maybe combining the best assets of both is one of the solutions moving forwards. Fantastic question to whoever asked that. Please feed in other questions. We'll try and cover off as many of these as we can. Let's play that forward a little bit. Another question that I think would be interesting to look at, and if we get our crystal ball out, so we've talked about what we see as some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. If we play that forwards 5 years from now, and we consider both the kind of technical or technological and personnel opportunities within pharma and indeed broader life science companies, the question is, what does that look like? What do we think is the ideal if we play that forwards 4 or 5 years? John, do you want to pick up on that first?
I always like looking into my crystal ball, and every time I've done that, I probably have to throw it away because the pace of change is just so rapid, and it is hard to predict. But in terms of thinking about where we're going, I think there's still related to the topics that I spoke about today, the need for key account management. From a data perspective, we're going to be collecting so much data, and one of the things that certainly in 5 years' time, really being able to put that data to use in real time, whether those are through protocols or frameworks, that physicians have access to, and they're able to make real time decisions. I'd like to say in 5 years that if I relate it back to the first question that we asked, or the second question that we asked Paul about how integrated market access is with our commercial teams, if we're thinking from a manufacturer perspective, that we've worked through, some of these models and broken down some of these barriers around communication. The way to do it is that we will get smarter with technology. The technology will be deployed to wider and wider masses, and there'll just be a greater understanding. I think one of the challenges is that, again, if I bring it back to the U.S., we haven't had to, address all the market access challenges until recently, and so there's a very, what I call a smaller set of stakeholders that really understand it and, how to build the strategies to be successful. And I think in 5 years' time, we'll have a much more aligned view. We'll have the right terminology. We'll have different strategies that have proven successful in helping brands to gain that market access, and it'll be kind of second nature. So that is my hope. But again, looking in the crystal ball is always dangerous.
We're not going to come back to this in 5 years' time and hold you to it, I'm sure, so don't worry. Leilani, let me build on that with you and just pick out one particular aspect that I think is potentially interesting, and feel free to discuss more broadly than this. But we see the term data scientist being used more and more now. people that really can understand what's coming out of this big data, what the insights mean. If we play that forwards 4 or 5 years' time, do the customer-facing teams all need to be, to some degree, data scientists?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, I'm going to be a lot more bullish and say I actually think that technology is going to solve a lot of these problems in much shorter time frame than 5 years. In particular, as we look at data linkage technology and machine learning, so many of these processes, data sets today they're managed in an analog fashion, and they can be managed in a highly digital fashion with advanced analytics, predictive analytics, comparative analytics. And I think the beauty there is when we think about, the salespeople or the customer-facing teams don't need to be data scientists. What we need is to have the expertise of those few brilliant data scientists being applied to democratize access to the data and the insights. So, again, my view is actually very bullish and very positive. I look at how many of these processes are manual today and how they can be improved with digital processes. Again, just looking at what we've been able to do with predictive analytics today, giving a customer-facing or physician-facing rep an alert that says there's been a formulary status change, they have that at their fingertips today. I mean, that is a game changer. Today they're able to see, because someone in the market access group and the managed care team, change the contract, change the relationship, and they're able to now pull that through with an alert for that rep on the iPad, on the iPhone, in the field. That is a game changer, and I think that's just the beginning. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So my prediction is it's not going to be 5 years. I think it's going to be much sooner. And I think what will happen with that kind of access to technology and data, again, we're really calling it the democratization of these insights, is that it'll bring these teams closer together. So, what is being engineered today, these key account management teams, I think will have a much more natural flow, because they'll all be looking at the same view, that same multifaceted view of the marketplace and the customers.
So let me pick up on that last point. I think that's really interesting, because you talk about the democratization of information, which is a concept I've heard a lot about and something I broadly agree with. But of course, the big life science companies are able to invest in technology that potentially can put them ahead of the customer knowledge. So is that something that you're seeing? Are we seeing, because of this shift where they have the right technology, that the customer-facing personnel are going in knowing almost more about these formulary changes in the products than some of the customers?
They can be. I mean, again, it's really a question of how successful they are at implementing this. I think I'll quote Mary Meeker, because I think she's brilliant, but she's a partner at Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Byers, a large venture capital firm here in the Silicon Valley, and every year she issues this fantastic report, sort of the state of technology and the internet. And she had a dedicated section this year on the digital health and the inflection point in digital health, and it was really worth a read to see where these changes are coming, faster than we expected. So it will be those first movers, in pharma and life sciences, who start to understand that we are at an inflection point from a technology, data, integrated data, and predictive analytics perspective, will absolutely get competitive advantage.
Yeah, interesting. That leads on to another question that's coming. I love it when we get these kind of questions that take us beyond our own sphere of life sciences. So, the question is, are there other industries that are seeing or have seen a similar change? And if so, where can we learn from those? And I guess it's an interesting question, because you think about the concept of value in life sciences and how it's been historically maybe separate to the efficacy of products. In many consumer industries, that is one and the same. It's something that is seen as the right value, the right price, the right product proposition. So do you want to pick up on that, Leilani? Do you see other industries that you think life sciences right now can be learning from here?
Yes and no. So I'm going to give you a funny example, and I don't really think it's the perfect example, but I do think when we talk about market access in particular, and when we talk about the friction that exists in the system, the airline industry is actually an interesting airline to compare to. And again, it's part of my past experience, professional experience. But it is interesting to see how the friction is now actually in the experience. For those of you who unfortunately have to travel frequently, you'll notice that the friction's in the experience, but it's no longer in the buying process. So I think, again, that was an industry that looked carefully for a number of years on where they could use technology to more efficiently remove friction from the buying process. But again, we could all talk about the experience, and it probably is not value. The value in the experience, I think, could be questioned, but that might be just from a buying perspective. And again, when we think about access, everybody has access now to something as simple as making an airline reservation. It didn't used to be that way 20 years ago.
Yeah, but I guess it varies from company to company, which is what we're seeing in life sciences right now. John, let me come over to you. Do you have a perspective on other industries where you see some of this change has maybe started to happen earlier, or have aspects that can be brought into life sciences?
I was trying to think, sort of as Leilani was speaking, and the one, even before she had mentioned it, kind of, airline came to mind. I mean, one of the other industries I guess I could think about is, just what we've been talking about, technology, so the IT world, and all of the things that we look at, some of the larger manufacturers. If we think about IBM, or we think of Microsoft, or we think of some of these other large B2B organizations, the way that they organize themselves in the past around key accounts, they've done a very good job of identifying their core customers, identifying their desired customers. They can't be one size fits all to everybody. So they did a really good job of segmenting their customers on both current potential as well as future potential, and picking a set of core customers as they built their key account strategy. So outside of airlines was one that I was thinking of. I think thinking the IT world and sort of that segment as being another one that we can look to for some learnings.
Very good. So I know we're heading into sort of the last 8 to 10 minutes here, so I'm just whizzing through quickly some of the comments that are coming in. So somebody has asked about the inflection point article, Leilani, that you just mentioned, if we can share a link. I know we've got our support teams tweeting on this webinar, so if they don't have that link now, we'll certainly tweet it out after the webinar, but they may have it to hand and be able to tweet it out shortly. And then the person asking the question around whether the UK is further ahead than the US has just come back with a reflection on what you were saying, Leilani, to say they agree with the point about medical education being more important and included now in that mix. So interesting to see that seems to be something universal. Let's bring the questions back to some of the practical stuff. And, people listening into this, I hope are getting a good sense of the direction of travel and some of the things they need to think about. But if you're somebody in charge of a sales team, of a commercial team right now, irrespective of where you may be, what's the most important change you should be making, the one most important thing to look at to take advantage of the direction of travel? John, do you want to start with that again?
Sure, Paul. So in terms of thinking about, one of the things that we always think about is, starting with an outside-in mentality. I think far too often, as we think about our clients, kind of there's the inside-out world of thinking. So, you get a small team together, we believe we got to have a camp strategy. This is how we're going to build it, or, this is what we think the market access strategy needs to be. Let's flip it on its head, and the teams that I've seen most successful have, not only done the inside out, but have taken that outside in approach. So really getting the voice of the customer. And if we go back to, what does market access mean today? It's just not payers anymore as that core customer from a market access perspective, but thinking about patients, thinking about HCPs, bringing their perspective into the equation. So I think one of the things that needs to be done at all steps is really make sure you're infusing that outside-in perspective. If it's not directly from customers, make sure that you're collecting that feedback on a regular basis from your customer-facing teams.
Yeah, interesting. And Leilani, from your perspective, would you agree with that? Do you think there's one core aspect that has to be a good starting point here?
I mean, to me, the best starting point is really to transform your view of a customer engagement and think about it more holistically. The customer is now, there are multiple customers, and the touch points with a customer are multiple touch points. Again, there are some digital touch points, some analog touch points, some medical, some sales, some marketing. So I think it's really moving away from this vision of I'm in sales, I'm in marketing, I'm in medical, that siloed departmental view, and having a holistic view of what does our customer engagement as a company, as a brand look like, and how do we think about that holistically, manage it holistically, market and sell it holistically.
Yeah, okay. Let's come back to this poll, the third poll that we started earlier. So if anybody hasn't voted on that and wants to cast their vote, do just take a little bit of time to cast your vote now, because the question we asked was, what is the biggest barrier for commercial teams wishing to use market access data and insights? The options being lack of access, lack of training, lack of tools, and lack of strategic alignment between teams. And as I said at the time, you may have other options you think are more important, but those are the four that we threw out there. So if I stop voting on that, and we just take a quick look, bear with me a second. Interesting. Well, it's quite a nice result in terms of what we're covering on this webinar. What we've seen come back from this, 36% saying lack of access, so lack of access to the market access data and insights. 9% each lack of training or lack of tools. 45% lack of strategic alignment between teams. To me, this kind of speaks directly to the combination of technology plus reorganization into more CAM-based approaches. Is that what you'd agree with, Leilani?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the lack of access. So this is where I think, again, it really is taking a different perspective on access. I almost wonder, does that mean lack of physical access? Because we know there are many ways to get access, again, to a prescriber, to a payer, and it makes me think about, really how when we think about what that digital transformation looks like, or where technology can help. How do you get access to, if you've got specialty treatments, to referring physicians? How do you get access to, again, a payer network if it's in a network? So that to me is the most interesting. It doesn't surprise me because I made the comment about that holistic customer engagement, the alignment between teams, but it's that lack of access that tells me we need to rethink access and look at all of the other ways that we can, again, gain access if we're losing direct access.
Yeah. And your perspective?
And I might add, I was just going to say, I think one of the things, Leilani, that you opened up with that spoke so powerfully that I would agree with is kind of, even the unstructured nature of the assets, right? So I take a little bit of a different view of the lack of access. And there is a lot of market access data out there, but they don't all talk together. They don't all sing together. And I know that our commercial manufacturers, or life science manufacturers, spend a lot of money figuring out ways to integrate the appropriate data sets, stitch them together, so that you can get a better picture of the customer. So I take a little bit of an end view to this, which, everything you said, Leilani, but also, one of the challenges, as it's not surprising that lack of access was so high, is just, how do we deal with so many disparate data sets and pulling them together in an efficient manner?
Yeah, interesting. So we're almost up against time, and we're not going to get through all of the questions, but one thing I think I would like to touch on from each of you to get a perspective on is we've talked about a combination of organizational change and technology within this webinar. I just want to focus on the technology aspect because we live in a world where we're surrounded by technology. It hits us from every angle in whatever the walk of life is. So, technology is only useful where it's used in the right way, it's designed in the right way. So I wanted to get your perspectives on when it comes to the technology component here and delivering value in terms of getting market access insights to commercial teams. What are the critical aspects of that, both in terms of what it does or how it's integrated into an organization? John, can I start with you on that one?
I'd actually defer to Leilani here, given her focus on technology, and then maybe I can come back.
Sure. Leilani, what do you think?
Well, I mean, in the most simplistic way, the technology has to be interoperable. It has to be something that is not one more thing to manage too. It has to be part and parcel of our processes and our people, right? So I always say it's this triangle. It's technology, people, and process, and they have to work together. So I think, you know, one of the most important aspects is, again, how can you get me relevant and meaningful technology that, as I said earlier, I see the role of technology now in particular as we look at where we're getting advanced analytics is being able to harness the expertise of a few rock stars and democratize that across an organization. So that means the right messaging, it means the right data, it means absolutely the right type of technology at the right time for the right stakeholder.
Yeah. And John, let me come back to you, because you're quite right. Leilani is the sort of technology expert here. But in terms of what you've seen in terms of how customer-facing teams are changing and some of the feedback you get on technology, would you agree with that? Do you think there are aspects that are particularly important from their perspective?
I would agree. I mean, I think to become, you know, an expert in everything, you know, we know the follies in that. So, you know, identifying a couple people who, you know how to find the data, know how to stitch the data together. You know, we all grew up with IMS data or other, you know, large data sets. There's much more data that's out there, both freely available as well as, you know, specialty data sets. You know, so encouraging teams, you know, ones that have been successful, have been able to identify those relevant data sets and then finding ways to build proprietary solutions in order to, you know, get a better view or a clearer view of the client.
Thank you, John. I'm going to wrap things up at this point because we're just slightly over the hour, but just a few final comments from me. I think, for me, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've heard from Leilani and John about how this combination of technology, organisational change are really key aspects. You know, we saw in the survey, we've heard here today, there's a real understanding that there's a need for more access to market access insights in those teams. But there are some challenges there. There is some organisational change that's needed. There are challenges around getting all this data and grouping it together. And as ever with these webinars, we have just scratched the surface of this. So, you know, I want to say a big thank you to both our speakers, Leilani and John, but certainly I'd encourage anybody listening in, whether you're now on the live webinar or on demand, to get in touch with either John or Leilani. John's details were on the slides earlier on. On the slide now, you've got the info@zephyrhealth.com email address. That'll get to Leilani. Do please put your questions across. If there's questions that have come in that we haven't got on to answer, we'll try and follow up on those, because as ever, time is a challenge on these webinars. And if you've joined us halfway through, or you had to leave early, or you missed a bit, you want to share it with friends, of course, the minute that we finish, the webinar is available on demand. So feel free to share that on, come back, listen again, feed in further questions. And thank you to everyone on Twitter who's been watching as well. I will wrap things up at that point. Thank you to all of you who've been listening, sharing your questions and voting, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.